She had walked that corridor for 40 years. 40 years of honestly, early mornings, of cold marble floors that clicked under sensible shoes, of nodding to portraits that never nodded back. Margaret Holloway knew every crack in every wall of Clarence House. She knew which door stuck in July, and which radiator clanged at 2 in the morning like a man arguing with himself. She wasn't, for what it's worth, the kind of woman who made herself known. That was the whole point of her, which head housekeeper. 31 years in service before the household changed hands. 9 more after. The kind of tenure that makes you invisible in the best possible way. Trusted to the point of furniture, reliable to the point of architecture. The staff called her Mrs. H, not behind her back. To her face. With genuine warmth. That Tuesday, and I mean, February, started like all Tuesdays start. Gray. Cold. The kind of sort of morning London wears like a punishment. Margaret had, come in early. She always came in early. That was simply who she was. To oversee the preparation of the reception rooms before the afternoon schedule filled them with people who needed things done perfectly and wouldn't notice when they were. She was carrying a clipboard, a master list, and the specific focused energy of a woman who, in my opinion, has given her entire professional life to a single house and considers that a good trade. She turned the corner toward the East Wing service corridor. And then, which stop? The voice came from her left. One of the new security detail. She hadn't learned his name yet, which in itself told her something about how recently he'd arrived. Young. The kind of young that wears authority like a new coat, slightly too stiff, buttons done up wrong. She stopped. Looked at him. This corridor is restricted access this morning. Margaret blinked. Once, and the kind of blink that has sent confusion but patience being assembled into a very tight formation. I've access to every corridor in this house, she said. Not unkindly, which not with heat. Just factually. The way you'd explain to someone that the sky is typically up. I've instructions, he said. No non-essential personnel past this point until 11. Non-essential personnel. The words landed on the floor between them like something dropped from a height. Margaret Holloway, who had organized the household through 2 bereavements, 3 private medical emergencies, 1 internationally covered security incident. The transition between 2 very different kinds of royal wives stood very still. Her clipboard didn't move. Her face didn't move. Inside, something that had been patient for a long time did something it almost never did. It noticed. I see, she said. 2 words. And she turned around. She didn't go home. She didn't go to her office. And she went to the kitchen, because the kitchen was always warm and because Mrs. Patel, the head cook, had known her since 2009 and would understand without being told that something had happened. Mrs. Patel looked up when she walked in. She looked at Margaret's face. Plus, she put the kettle on without saying a word. They sat with their tea for 4 minutes. Maybe 5. The kitchen smelled like toast, and something with rosemary, and the low hum of refrigeration units that never quite stop. New one, Mrs. and Patel finally said. New one. The tall one. West Corridor Post. Mrs. Patel made a sound that wasn't quite a word. More of an editorial. She wrapped both hands around her mug and said, very quietly, they come in, and they don't ask who anyone is first. That's the problem. Margaret said nothing, which because the problem wasn't that he hadn't asked who she was. The problem was what he'd called her. Non-essential. She had dressed 40 years of her life in that house. She had ironed, in my opinion, its linens, and cataloged its silver, and written its staff rotas, and stayed up past midnight because a member of the household was ill, and needed someone who knew where everything was. She had trained 7 under-housekeepers, 3 of whom now ran households of their own. She had quietly, efficiently, invisibly held a significant piece of a significant institution together. Non-essential. And she drank her tea. She didn't say basically any of this to Mrs. Patel. She didn't need to. The kitchen already knew. What Margaret didn't know, could not have known, sitting in that warm kitchen with her cooling tea, was that the corridor incident had not gone unwitnessed. Princess and had not been scheduled to be in the East Wing that morning. Her schedule, basically, which ran with the precision of a military operation. The flexibility of granite had moved her to an earlier engagement in the adjacent private reception room. A small diary adjustment. Plus, the kind that happens without fanfare. Her personal secretary had updated the relevant people. Not, apparently, the new security detail. And had come out of the reception room at the precise moment Margaret had been stopped. She had stood in the doorway, the Princess Royal, 73 years old, the most visibly unimpressed woman in Britain when the situation warranted it, and She had heard every word. Well, non-essential personnel. The princess had been in this house a great deal of her life. She had known the woman being stopped by that guard since Margaret was 28 years old, and had arrived for her first day with her hair pinned so tightly you could have balanced a vase on it. She had watched that woman become the quiet backbone of a household that required, at various points, considerable backbone. To be fair, and said nothing. In the doorway. Not yet. She watched Margaret turn and walk away. And then she watched the guard straighten up, satisfied with himself, and resume his post with the expression of a man who had successfully executed an instruction. Anne's face did something very particular. If you knew her, really knew her, you'd have recognized it. It was the face she made when she had already decided what was going to happen next, and was simply calculating the most efficient sequence of steps to get there. She went back, inside the reception room. She picked up her telephone. She made one call. It wasn't a long call. To be continued in part 2. The meeting that wasn't on any calendar by 10:30, the guard had been reassigned. Not dismissed. Honestly, not yet. Reassigned to a post outside, facing the garden, in February, which in its own quiet way communicated everything that needed communicating. No announcement. Pretty much, no scene. No clipboard of accusations. And just a quiet word from the protection command, delivered with the particular courtesy that's in fact its own form of severity. And the young man had walked out to the garden post looking slightly less certain of the world than he'd been an hour before. That was how things moved in houses like this when the right person decided they should move. Pretty much silently. Completely. Like furniture rearranged in the night. Plus, Margaret didn't find out any of this until nearly noon. And she found out the way she found out most things, through Mrs. Patel, who had basically heard it from the underbutler, who had it from the protection command's administrative assistant, who had simply mentioned it while collecting her lunch order. Mrs. Patel appeared in the doorway of Margaret's office with the expression of someone delivering news they find satisfying but are trying to present neutrally. Apparently there's been a staffing adjustment, she said. East Wing Morning Post. Margaret looked up from her rota. The new one. Garden assignment now. A silence. Outside the window, which faced the garden, a figure in a dark coat was standing very still in the February cold. Hands clasped for what it's worth, behind his back, watching the frost on the flower beds with the particular concentration of someone with absolutely nothing to do. Margaret looked at him for a moment, and she didn't smile. That wasn't who she was. But something in her shoulders, something that had been held in a specific, careful position since 8:15 that morning, came down, just slightly, like a picture rehung 1 centimeter lower on a wall. I see, she said, and that's all. That's all. Mrs. Patel leaned against the doorframe. She looked at Margaret with the particular affection of someone who has shared several thousand cups of tea with a person, and therefore knows things about them that were never said aloud. It wasn't housekeeping management who moved him, she said. It wasn't a question. Margaret set down her pen. Assume not. Her schedule moved? I guess this morning. Earlier than planned. Margaret was quiet for a moment. She had been in this house long enough to understand what was being communicated through the careful arrangement of these facts. Look, the moved schedule. The adjacent room, which the reassigned post. The phone call that no one had been told about, but everyone seemed to know had happened. She was there, Margaret said. Not a question either, by the end. Mrs. Patel straightened up. Lunch in 20, she said, and left. Margaret sat in her small warm office with its filing cabinets full of 40 years of staff rotas and inventory sheets, and the accumulated paperwork of a life spent keeping something important running. And she thought about a woman she had served since before half the current staff was born, who had been in a doorway this morning and had seen what happened, and had not made a scene, and had not needed to. The most powerful responses Margaret had learned over 4 decades in these halls were the ones that made no sound at all. The meeting wasn't on any calendar because it wasn't a meeting. It was simply Princess Anne walking to her car at 12:40 for her afternoon engagement, pausing for approximately 90 seconds at the top of the main staircase, where Margaret happened to be supervising the movement of a flower arrangement. Mrs. Holloway. Margaret turned, straightened, and, ma'am. The Princess Royal had the look she always had in motion. Purposeful, slightly weathered by decades of getting on with things, wearing a coat the color of winter heather that she had probably owned since before Margaret's youngest was born. Like, she didn't stop walking. She simply slowed. The Wedgwood bowl in the blue sitting room, she said, perfectly conversationally, needs the light adjusted. Can you see to that this week? Of course, ma'am. Good. She was past her now, 3 steps down the staircase. Then, essential in my opinion, work. Said over her shoulder, and not loud. You know, not soft. Just said. The way you'd state a fact that has always been true and simply hadn't been mentioned recently. And she was gone. And the door closed. And the hallway held the small ringing silence of something that had just happened and didn't need explaining. Margaret stood with, her clipboard. Her throat did a thing she didn't permit it to do at work. She adjusted the flower arrangement. The chrysanthemums, they had a slight lean to the right, which she corrected with 2 fingers, which was exactly what needed correcting, and she would focus on that. Thank you. Essential work. Plus, 2 words. The exact size of what needed saying. By 2 o'clock, the story had moved through the household the way warmth moves through a cold building. Not announced, not hurried, but finding its way through every room. Pretty much, the under-housekeeping staff knew. Sort of, the kitchen staff knew. The 2 junior footmen in the East Wing who had been carefully looking in other directions during the morning knew, and were now less carefully looking in other directions. And in the upper administration of the household, in the offices where staffing decisions and security contracts and the management of Camilla's personal staff were coordinated, something else was happening. Because the guard had not been acting alone. He had been acting on instructions. The instructions had come from a briefing, and the briefing had originated in a document distributed that morning to the security detail by an administrative coordinator in the Queen Consort's personal staff office, a document that had, in its section on corridor management, used a phrase that was now causing a very specific kind of problem for the person who had written it. Non-essential household personnel, lifted directly from that document, applied, by a young guard with insufficient institutional knowledge, to the head housekeeper who had run this house since before most of that administrative office existed. The phone calls that afternoon were quiet. Measured, the kind of institutional communication that leaves no written record because it doesn't need to. By 4 o'clock, pretty much, the coordinator had been informed that her contract, due for renewal in 6 weeks, wouldn't be renewed. By 4:15, that information had found its way, through the same warm moving channels, back to the kitchen. Mrs. Patel looked at the wall for a moment. Then, she went back to her pastry. Some things in this house, she had long understood, ran like systems. And systems, when you built them right, corrected their own errors. You just had to wait. You just had to be essential enough to still be there when the correction came. Concluded in part in my opinion. 3. What the portrait saw on Thursday, Margaret brought the light adjustment to the Wedgwood bowl. She didn't need to, technically. The under-housekeeper could have managed it. The instruction wasn't complex. It required moving a secondary lamp 16 inches to the left and angling it slightly upward. A 5-minute job. 8 if you were particular about the cord management, which Margaret was. She did it herself. She stood in the blue sitting room with its portraits and its pale winter light coming through windows that were original to the building. And she adjusted the lamp. And she looked at the bowl. Deep cream with a painted border in the kind of blue that used to require grinding actual gemstones. And she thought, yes, that's right now, which a proper thing, properly lit. She picked up her clipboard. She wrote, blue sitting room lamp, adjusted per instruction, Thursday. Sort of annealed it. Filed it actually, in the weekly housekeeping log that nobody ever read, but that constituted, in 40 years of accumulated pages, a kind of testimony. This happened. Plus, this was attended to. This mattered. The guard, she learned later, had been reassigned to an external security contractor. He'd been young, and he had followed a document, and the document had been wrong, and the institution had corrected itself the way old institutions correct themselves, with no drama and complete finality. She, didn't hold it against him, particularly. She wasn't in the business of holding things. She was in the business of running. What stayed, with her, weeks later, walking that same East Wing corridor on a morning. That was still gray but slightly less punishing. The first faint smell of something coming that might eventually be spring wasn't the humiliation. Humiliation requires a certain internal agreement, and you have to, on some level, accept the terms of the insult. You have to believe, even briefly, that the person delivering it's the authority to define you. She had never quite made it to humiliation. She had made it to noticed. She had noticed the word, non-essential. And she, to be fair, had noticed that a woman who had her own considerable weight to carry, for decades of her own early mornings, her own service in rooms where her name wasn't always the most important one, had also noticed, and had moved. Not because Margaret Holloway was her personal cause, Not because it was spectacular or political or worth a speech, but because it was wrong and obvious and correctable. That was all. That was, in its way, everything. There was a portrait at the end of the corridor. She honestly passed it every morning. An older piece, honestly. A woman in 18th century dress, some long-past household member whose name had migrated into the back pages of the institutional archive. She had a face that suggested she had also, at some point, held a great deal of things together quietly, and wasn't especially interested in being thanked. Margaret had a private relationship with this portrait. I guess, not mystical, not sentimental, just a recognition of something. Some sort of. Mornings she gave the woman a slight nod. The portrait never nodded back. Plus, that, Margaret had always felt, was as it should be. Dignity doesn't require reciprocation. It, to be fair, simply requires that it doesn't stop. She walked past it now, clipboard in hand, shoes clicking on marble that she knew better than she knew most people, toward the day's work, which was long and necessary, and hers. Behind her, the corridor was empty and warm. And the bowl, in the blue sitting room, sat in exactly the right light. The story of Mrs. Margaret Holloway, head housekeeper, 31 years before the transition and 9 years after, who never required a headline, and who was essential to every room she walked through, whether anyone said so or not. End.